Hey everybody, my name is John, and I want to start sharing my progress while I'm developing my first video game with anyone who may be interested in my journey or the game dev process. This is the first time I've ever tried to build a video game, besides playing around with my TI-83 calculator in high school a long time ago. I always had a creative itch, and I love creating things and the whole process of learning a new system that will allow me to make something that never existed before. Like several of my experiences with creativity, I found myself sometimes watching videos of people creating, like making art with Photoshop, or music and Logic, or 3D creations in Blender. And then inevitably, I go, I think I'll give it a try. And several months later, I've been through an entire amateur project in the process of learning as I do. So after watching a few game devlogs recently, I thought it would be fun to try to make a video game. I love open source communities and software, so I chose Godot 4 as my game engine. I suddenly got a random flash of inspiration for the art style of the game. I grew up playing a lot of point-and-click adventure games, and I wanted to try to recreate the visual style of these late 80s and early 90s games, such as Monkey Island and Loom. I love the colors in them, but I especially love dithering. If you don't know what dithering is, it's the process of creating the illusion of more colors and detail while only using a limited color palette. You see, old computers could only display, for example, 16 colors. So in order to make the user feel like they're getting more colors and gradients, artists would alternate pixels between solid colors. The dithering itself would sometimes have really beautiful patterns that added so many vibes to what we were seeing. And just like other unintentional hardware limitations of the past, like record pops, tape hiss, or film grain, I want to bring it back. My second idea was to have this dithered style generated automatically, but in a first-person perspective, sort of like Myst or The Witness. So after downloading Godot, I set out figuring out how to make the color and dithering style happen. I found a few shaders already available online and some really great devlogs for a game called Return of the Obra Dinn, which recently made dithering a central focus. I used some pieces of code and taught myself the general logic behind what's happening in the shader, and many conversations with ChatGPT ended up with my dithering shader. So the shader will first downscale the image. That makes the pixels really big. And then it automatically resizes a pattern that it will use as a reference to tell it when to pick this color pixel or that color pixel. And at the end, it will limit the amount of values it can choose for the red, green, and blue channel before finally showing us the pixels that were chosen. I chose to use the 16 colors of the Commodore 64 or EGA colors for my palette to capture the feeling I had of some of those old games I mentioned. I also feel like the most creative decisions happen when artists have constraints on their tools or abilities. So after setting up a little scene and walking around with the dithering shader working, I felt really excited that my ideas are actually starting to work, and I love the way this looks. So I followed a few tutorials to create a player and their controls to be able to walk around and look in the world. Next, I decided to flesh out my world with a little bit of animated background elements. In some of those older games, the background animations like water waves or birds would have been drawn at a very low frame rate, like 2 or 4 frames per second. So I figured out that using Godot's particle system, you could create some cartoon-looking waves and make them automatically move at any frame rate you want. I made a sprite sheet with a few different frames of a wave going from a little wave to a big wave, and it'll just flip through those frames like a flip book at whatever rate I want. These waves are moving at 4 frames per second, and that feels about right for me. Other things can be animated with the animation player. You can set a start point and an end point and bake the animation to whatever frame rate you want. Then you can set the keyframes to activate it in discrete steps instead of a smooth motion. It kind of looks jerky and choppy, and I really like that a lot. Next, I wanted a way for the player to interact with the world, similar to a point-and-click adventure, but it would have to make sense for a first-person game. I went into Photoshop and created some reticles that will go in the center of the screen to indicate to the player that they're looking at something that they can interact with. I have a ray shooting forward from the player's head, and any object that it collides with, it will tell the system to display the appropriate reticle for that object, and the distance the player is from it chooses which reticle to display. When you're far away, it's a dot. When you're a little closer, an eye appears, letting you know that you can click to look at the object, and the player character will give a reaction. Finally, at the closest point, you will see a hand or speech bubble indicating that you can physically interact with an object or talk to an NPC. After having a nice little test world to move around in, I wanted to add some sound effects to the game. So I went to Pixabay, where there are lots of free sound effects that people have uploaded, and I got some footsteps and some beach sounds. I wanted my sound effects to match the vibe of the visual style. And one of the computer hardware limitations of the past was that the sample rate of audio played was a lot lower than it is today. So I jumped into Logic and loaded my sound effects. I applied an effect called Bit Crusher, which simulates a reduction in the sample rate of audio. It's a little harsh and hard to describe, but here's what it sounds like. Once I made a few environmental sounds and dropped them into my game, it really made the experience a million times more immersive. The last thing I worked on was implementing a dialogue system, so the player can have a conversation with other characters. I decided to use Dialogue Manager, and after watching some tutorials, I was able to drop it in and write a short test script for a character, as well as some moments where the player can choose a response to get them to engage with the character a little bit. This will be a way for the player to learn about things to do in the game, and some puzzles involving giving items to characters that need something or other things like that. Now, as far as what my game will be about, it's been evolving and I've been brainstorming with some friends, but the main gist is that I'm trying to create a sense of wonder about dreams. I'm specifically going for the psychological aspect of some of my favorite movies, in particular the movie Waking Life, where the main character is popping in and out of different places in conversations with people before they finally wonder where they are and who these people are, and they realize that I also like Vanilla Sky, where Tom Cruise begins to wonder why his experiences in his life are starting to be jumbled and make no sense at all. And it's got a mind-blowing twist at the end. You should definitely go watch that movie. So since my game is going to take place in a dream, I think it frees me up because I can basically create any characters, places, or experiences for the player that I want, and it all will fit in because in dreams, there are no rules. It also should lead to some really interesting storytelling because the player will be wondering who they are, why they're here, and what's really going on. For now, that's a mystery for me to create and for anyone who ends up playing the game to discover. I'm excited to keep developing this game, and I hope to keep sharing the journey. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all in the dream world.